Passage number 3 from test 3, numbers 23 to 33. Let's begin with number 23. How do you like those apples? Marketed as Smart Fresh, the chemical 1-MCP, 1-methylcyclopropene, has been used by fruit growers since 2002 in the United States and elsewhere to preserve the crispness and lengthen the storage life of apples and other fruit, which often must travel long distances before being eaten by consumers. 1-MCP lengthened storage life by 3 to 4 times when applied to apples. This extended life allows producers to sell their apples in the off-season, months after the apples have been harvested. So which choice best combines these sentences? So let's go through them. A, when applied to apples, 1-MCP lengthens storage life by 3 to 4 times, allowing producers to sell their apples in the off-season, months after the apples have been harvested. One looks pretty good. It's logical. It's clean, it makes sense, no redundancies, no wordiness. Looks pretty solid, right? We're applying this MCP to apples. It's lengthening the storage life. This ultimately allows them to sell their apples later, right? Because their storage life is longer. So A looks good. But we always check all 4. Producers are allowed to sell their apples months after they have been harvested in the off-season because 1-MCP, when applied to apples, lengthens their storage life by 3 to 4 times. So let's see. What's a little bit odd here, this isn't the worst choice, I suppose, but there are some problems. Producers are allowed to sell their apples months after they've been harvested. When you lead with this, it's unclear at first why they're allowed to do this. It almost seems like they're looking for permission. Whereas in A, we know what allows them to do this. It's not permission, it's ability, right? It's the ability to do this because of these lengthening properties of the lifespan of this chemical. So that doesn't really make sense. This parenthetical insertion in dashes in the off season is weird because it almost seems like it's saying that they were harvested in the off season. That's confusing. So there's an ambiguity there. The rest of it isn't terrible, but I think there are enough problems in B that it's just not as clear as A. 1-MCP lengthens storage life when applied to apples by 3 to 4 times, allowing producers to sell their apples months after the apples have been harvested in the off-season. This is even worse. This is seeming like they're basically saying that the apples are harvested in the off-season, whereas it should be saying that they can sell the apples in the off-season after they've been harvested. So that's one major error. That's enough for us to get rid of C. Months after apples have been harvested, producers are allowed to sell their apples, in the off-season, because 1-MCP lengthens storage life when applied to apples by 3 to 4 times. This parenthetical, this non-essential use of in the off-season doesn't work because it's essential. We need that to understand what's going on here. Also, we have this issue of producers are allowed. We don't know why they're allowed until later. We need the explanation first before we determine what it is that allows them to do this. So for that reason, we're going to have choice A. Okay, moving on. And at a cost of about 1 cent per pound of apples, 1-MCP is a highly cost-effective treatment. However, 1-MCP is not a panacea for fruit producers or sellers. There are problems and limitations associated with its use. 1-MCP works by limiting a fruit's production of ethylene. It is a chemical that causes fruit to ripen and eventually rot. So here we've got a comma spliced, 2 complete sentences separated with just a comma. We can get rid of A. Being is not going to fix it. Again, being is almost always wrong. In this case, it just creates a weird fragment that's not clear what that is referring to. It's very vague. C is also going to be a comma splice because that is a chemical that causes fruit to ripen, is a complete sentence. So we can get rid of C. And finally, D, we're going to delete it because when we delete it, we create an appositive. A positive phrase defines what ethylene is. We can connect it to the sentence with just a comma as we do here. So we're fine with that. And it fixes the original. So this one's going to be D. 25. While 1-MCP keeps apples tight and crisp. So tight is the wrong word here. We want something more like firm. You would describe an apple as being firm, not tight, not stiff, not taut. Though they're in the same universe of words, it's not appropriate to describe apples as stiff or taut or tight. Firm is what you would say. So the word choice leads us to B. 26. While 1-MCP keeps apples tight and crisp for a month, it also limits their scent production. So is their correct here? Well, their is referring to the apples, right? The apples scent production. Apples is plural, their is plural. So that looks pretty good. We know it's not B because that's the wrong there. That's the place there. We know it's not D because that is it is. That's not even possessive. C is singular, which is not good. So we're happy with the original. There is fine. 27. This may not be much of a problem with certain kinds of apples that are not naturally very fragrant, such as Granny Smith, but for apples that are prized for their fruity fragrance, such as McIntosh, this can be a problem with consumers that will reject apples lacking the expected aroma. So here we're using a relative pronoun to refer to people. And remember what we need to use here? We need to use who. Or whom in some cases, but in this case, who. And we look at the choices. The only one that works is D. C, we don't use which with people. We saw that in the lecture videos. We don't use they because that's going to create a comma splice. A, we've discussed just like which can't refer to people. So we use D, who. Okay, number 28. But some fruits do not respond as well to one MCP as others did, and some even respond adversely. So we've changed the tense here from present tense do, right, respond present tense, to past tense did. And we need to put that into present tense. So all we really need to do is just do here. But some fruits do not respond as well to one MCP as others do. So we like do. B is the answer. It's not going to be did. Have is past tense technically when the way it's structured, right? Some fruits do not respond as well to MCP as others have, kind of implying in the past. And then will is future tense. So the only one that's consistent with our tenses is B. Number 29. Furthermore, some fruits, particularly those that naturally produce a large amount of ethylene, do not respond as well to 1-MCP treatment. Take Bartlett pears, for instance. Unless they are treated with exactly the right amount of 1-MCP at exactly the right time, they remain hard and green until they rot. Okay, so what's going on here? Take Bartlett pears, for instance, comma, unless they are treated. The original is a comma splice, which is no good. C is going to have the same problem. Take Bartlett pears, period, for instance, unless they are treated. I mean, that's not terrible. Choice D, because at least it's kind of connecting the sentences, though, well, separating them. But that would be, I suppose, a legal connection, but so let's hold that aside. The original isn't going to work because it's a comma splice. C as well as a comma splice. Notice in B, we have this colon to set up the sentence as follows. That works pretty good. Take Bartlett pears, for instance, colon, unless they are treated with exactly the right amount of 1-MCP, ... So this is pretty good too. So how do we choose between C, B, and D? I think the major issue with D is we need this for instance to be connected to the pears, right? The for instance goes with the taking of the pears. In other words, let's take pears as an example, right? You wouldn't say, as another way to put this, take Bartlett pears, period. For example, unless they are treated. That's not as direct as saying, take Bartlett pears, for example, colon, and then you go into the example. So even though D is okay, we like B better. It's a more logical way to connect these sentences. So number 30, take Bartlett pears, for instance, unless they are treated with exactly the right amount of 1-MCP at exactly the right time, they will remain hard and green until they rot, and consumers who experience this will be unlikely to purchase them again. So where should we put sentence 4? So sentence 4 is this one. But some fruits do not respond as well to 1-MCP as others do, and some even respond adversely. So do we want to move this around? I mean, notice this is kind of introducing the idea that 1-MCP is a problem. It's not just something that's beneficial, right, which is what we're talking about in the first part, that's got some issues, right? Notice sentence 1 describes what MCP does. Sentence 2 starts discussing the problems with 1-MCP. And then sentence 3 talks about problems with particular kinds of apples. Sentence 5 talks about more problems with 1-MCP with certain fruits. And then sentence 6 talks about pears that have that problem. So we would rather have this introductory sentence right before we start going into the problems. So the passage would read like this. 1-MCP works by limiting a fruit's production of ethylene, a chemical that causes fruit to ripen and eventually rot. But some fruits do not respond well to 1-MCP as others do, And then it goes on to describe all those problems. So it makes sense to put this after sentence 1. So that's why we go with B. Where it is now doesn't make sense. We've already established these problems. So to have this introductory sentence at that moment doesn't make sense. Putting it after 2 doesn't make sense because in sentence 2, we've already talked about the problems. And then putting it after sentence 5 doesn't make sense because, again, we're in the middle of talking about the problems with this chemical. Introducing the problems in the middle of it doesn't make any sense. We want to introduce them before we get into the discussion. So that's why this one is B. Number 31. Finally, researchers have found that 1-MCP actually increases susceptibility to some pathologies in certain apple varieties. For example, Empire apples are prone to a condition that causes the flesh of the apple to turn brown. Traditionally, apple producers have dealt with this problem by leaving the apples in the open air for 3 weeks before storing them in a controlled atmosphere with tightly regulated temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide levels. As the graph shows, the flesh of untreated Empire apples that are first stored in the open air undergoes roughly 5% less browning than the flesh of untreated Empire apples that are immediately put into storage in a controlled environment. So the question for 31 wants to know if this is the best interpretation of the graph. So what does the graph show? Does it show that the ones put in open air first, which are these, untreated, experience 5% less browning than the ones that are put immediately into storage? Now, in fact, they experience a lot less browning than just 5% less. It's like 90% less, right? It goes from 50% browning down to around 45 or down to around 5% browning. So that's a huge drop. We're looking for the percent drop here, not just the fact that this is 5% browning. In an absolute sense, it's much less than 5% of, it's much more than a 5% decrease as we go from the controlled to the open air variety. So for that reason, the original is not good. Let's look at B. Empire apples that are first stored in the open air undergoes roughly half of their, doesn't make any sense. No, we're looking at, 31 right here. There we go. Makes more sense. As the graph shows, the flesh of untreated Empire apples that are first stored in the open air undergoes slightly more browning than the flesh of untreated Empire apples that are put into a controlled environment. No, they get much less browning. Much less browning. This is really low compared to the controlled, so B isn't right. Twice as much browning? No, again, this should be much less. D, substantially less browning? Yes, exactly. These ones put in open air have much less browning than we see in the untreated controlled case. So that's why we get D. Number 32. However, when Empire apples are treated with 1-MCP, their flesh turns brown when the apples are first stored in the open air, though not under other conditions. So again, which choice best fits the graph? We can look in the graph and see when they're treated with 1-MCP, there's no difference. Actually, it's worse in the case where it used to be better. That's not good, right? When you're treating it with this chemical, your old plan doesn't work anymore. In fact, it's worse because your browning increases when you used your old strategy. So this doesn't capture that. It says that the flesh turns brown when they're first stored in open air, though not under other conditions. That's not true. We see they also turn brown in controlled atmospheres, so we can get rid of A. How about B? However, when Empire apples are treated with 1-MCP, roughly half of their flesh turns brown, regardless of whether the apples are first stored in the open air. Yeah, that's true. About 50% turns brown regardless of what you do. So B looks pretty solid. Their flesh browns when they are put directly into a controlled atmosphere, but not when they are first stored in the open air. No, again, both of them brown pretty equally. Their flesh turns brown when they are first stored in the open air, though not as quickly as the apple flesh in the untreated group does. We have no idea about the speed of the browning. All we know is the extent of the browning, how much of it browns in this time period, not about the speed. So we can get rid of D. Best choice here is B. Last question is 33. Although researchers continue to search for the right combination of factors that will keep fruits fresh and attractive, the problem may be that consumers are overly concerned with superficial qualities rather than the actual freshness of the fruit. Okay, so the writer wants a conclusion that conveys how the shortcomings of 1-MCP affect the actions of people in the fruit industry. Which choice best accomplishes the goal? Notice this has nothing to do with how it affects the actions of people in the fruit industry. This is talking about consumers and what consumers like. So that's not quite right. How about B? Although researchers continue to search for the right combination of factors, many of the improvements to fruit quality they have discovered so far have required trade-offs in other properties of the fruit. Again, says really nothing about how this affects people in the industry. Although researchers continue to search for the right combination of factors, for now, many fruit sellers must weigh the relative values of aroma, color, and freshness when deciding whether to use one MCP. Notice this is talking about what the sellers have to do, right? People in the industry, they have to weigh all these factors. That seems to make sense. How about D? Although researchers continue to search for the factors, it must be acknowledged that one MCP, despite some inadequacies, has enabled the fruit industry to ship and store fruit in ways that weren't possible before. So it is at least talking about the fruit industry, which is good, I guess. But this is not talking about their actions. Sure, it talks about that they can ship and store fruit in different ways. That's great. But it's not talking about how they have to continue how they have to deal with the shortcomings of one MCP in terms of how they sell and process and whatever to their fruit. So even though D is not, I think, the worst, we like C better because it does the job of the original question much better than choice D. Even though choice D seems attractive because it repeats the words fruit industry, it's not quite what we're looking for because it's too limited just to talk about the shipping and storing. C captures it much more generally. So this one is going to be C.